I'm Mark Davey. I'm the District Superintendent for CVES BOCES, and I'd like to welcome everyone here. CVES is very pleased to be hosting the Rural Schools Association Issues Forum tonight. We have a tremendous leader in rural education, but also a tremendous gentleman who's here tonight, the Executive Director of the Rural Schools Association. And so it's our privilege to really welcome you, David. Just a little bit about David, and we'll get started here. First, David has deep ties to the Midwest and rural America, Ohio, Illinois, and so on and so forth, but he graduated from Brittenkill down in the Troy area, Tamarack High School. Did go to school in Ohio, Wittenberg College, went to Capital Law School in Ohio as well, in the Columbus area, right up down the road from Ohio State. But then came back to New York, and after passing the bar, actually was the counsel for the state legislature for 17 years. Then transitioned and actually moved to be the director of New York State School Boards Association, director of governmental relations. And did that, David, for 15 years. So he has 27 years of public service. After he retired from the School Boards Association, he then became the executive director of the New York State Rural Schools Association. So he not only is he a tremendous leader, but he's a tremendous advocate for rural education, supporter of students, supporter of educators, and we're so pleased that he's here. With that said, we have a lot of different folks here, so we're really not going to go around and acknowledge everyone and your roles and everything, but I do want to take a moment and just acknowledge Linda Gagnon-Horn, who is one of our BOCES board members and has been on our BOCES board for many, many years, hails from the Northeastern Clinton District, but she's also been a member for almost a decade on the Rural Schools Association board as well, board of directors. So Linda is not only a dedicated local board member for us, and has been for many, many years, but also a strong supporter of the Rural Schools Association. And I will acknowledge Jennifer Christensen, one of our special education principals at CVES, who's going to be our recorder this evening. So David, I want to say on behalf of our entire region, thank you for being here on behalf of CVES BOCES and all of our schools and all the rural educators in the region, but as well as all of our communities. Thank you so much for being here, and we're so pleased that you're here to share this evening.
Thank you, Mark. Really appreciate it. You read that almost as well as I wrote it for him. No, it's not true. I say what I do now is penance for what I did for the 17 years I spent in the legislature. I was board president at Brittenkill at the time that I was also working as local government and home rule council in the legislature, and it was just by happenstance. I was in Lake Placid watching their interim director of governmental relations give a really horrific presentation. And when I started talking to the executive director of the School Boards Association, who was also a Buckeye, about that presentation, he said, we need a director of governmental relations. I said, yeah, I just saw the presentation, you really do. And but I didn't know that he would show up in my office a few days later and say, would you come and do this for us? So it was great, except that I did have to resign from my local board in order to take that position. So in hindsight, it's probably the right move to do that. But I knew that I was going to be directing rural schools about 10 months before I retired. I knew how much time I had in the state retirement system. Got really lucky to start in the state retirement system 2 months after the bar exam. So, but the idea, let me get to what we're all about tonight. The idea, and this is the 7th of the regional issues forums that we've held. We're holding them to hear from you. I'm going to give you a little briefing about why it's important that we're meeting, and then the rest of the night is your describing the challenges and issues that you're facing. And let me tell you why it's important for us to do that, but first I'll tell you the format. We have all these forums, and I've held them from Dunkirk, which is as far as you can go. You can spit on Pennsylvania from Dunkirk, all the way out at the other end of the thruway. And I've held one in Riverhead, which is next to Montauk, which is the very end of Suffolk County, on the edge of Long Island. And you can see Rhode Island from there. So from one end of the state to the other, we've been holding these things because a while back ago, I recognized that we were in a crisis mode and our state hasn't recognized that we're in a crisis mode. I keep saying, in fact, I've said to these folks in interviews, if this kind of a crisis were happening either in an urban area or in a suburban area, it would have been on the front page of the New York Times every day for a month. Right? It's happening where we don't have a lot of media. It's happening where we more and more don't have a lot of people. And so the message isn't getting out about what's happening. But let me describe a little bit about what I was seeing and how this may all converge for us, and therefore why it's so important for us to gather the information. From here, we impanel a task force to come up with solutions, hopefully means of addressing the issues that you've identified, put it together in a policy brief, and then we have an advocacy action plan to try and bring those issues to our state and federal leaders. I always say that you never give a state leader an issue without also telling them how to solve it. You can't rely on them to come up with it on their own out of the blue, given the breadth of issues that they face. And so we really want to be able to hone in on things that will help. So we've got to figure out what we're facing first. So this is the part where I make sure nobody's got their penknives with them, because you may stick it through your eye by the time I get done with this. So bear with me for about 5 minutes or so to tell you how bad your lives are. Here's what we're facing. Post-Great Recession, New York State in the last decade has lost 1 million people out of New York State. 1 million people have left New York. Now, during the Great Recession in other states, people left rural areas, but they migrated from the rural areas of their state to the suburban and urban areas of their state. In New York State, we had a grapes of wrath-like exodus where people left the state completely. Businesses left, there weren't any jobs, and people left. Our college-educated kids aren't coming back like they do in other states. In other states, it's a rite of passage everywhere. Kids are young, they leave, they want to go away, they want to experience something else. Then all of a sudden they want to settle down, they want to meet somebody, they want to start a family, they want to be a little closer to home, and statistically, they return close to home. It doesn't happen in New York. And the reason it doesn't happen is because those jobs left in the meantime. Okay, during that 10-year period, those jobs are gone, and they're largely, like in Allentown, they're not coming back. Those jobs are not coming back. Okay? Hopefully, there will be different jobs. And our schools now have the philosophical, internal discussion about whether to educate our kids for their broadest breadth of possibilities. Are we educating them so that they have the most possibilities for employment, no matter where that exists? Or are we educating them to try and preserve our communities, for trying to educate them in a way that they can serve their local community in the jobs that the local community may have in the future? And there's no right answer to that. Okay? They're both valuable and viable goals. Right? We want to preserve our community, and the school is as central to a community's existence as any part of it. They actually have studies that are almost like atomic bomb studies. When you remove a school from a community, what happens at 1 mile out, 5 miles out, 10 miles out? There are fallout zones of what happens economically when you do that, and in many cases, it destroys the community. So New York State lost 1 million people. And it's not just that the state lost them. Long Island has largely stayed steady as a region in terms of population. New York grew during that time. New York City grew during that time. And all of the upstate Big Five cities all stayed stable during that time. Rural New York lost 1 million people plus, because it's 1 million people plus however many it's offset by the growth in other areas of the state. Next year, the U.S. Census will document that loss of residency in New York. Federal aid is based per capita. We'll lose a lot of federal aid. Our state aid formula for school is based on student enrollment, and I've yet to be in a rural school that hasn't at least lost 20% of its enrollment from its high, and most of them are closer to 30%. Some of them are more. Once that gets kind of documented, the other thing that happens is we have a political issue. Now, and all of that is in the context of every year. So this isn't just take a 10-year block and we now have less sales tax than we had 10 years ago. That's not what I'm about to tell you. Every year for 10 years, rural New York has had less sales tax than the year before. It's like compounded interest. So, like, 2006 was better than 2007, better than 2008. So we are dramatically lower now in terms of sales tax. That's bottomed out a little bit, and hopefully, the economy in general is starting to rebound. New York State itself is healthy, but 40 years ago, here was the situation in New York. New York State had 17 million acres in agricultural production. Okay? Now we have 7 million. Okay? 40 years ago, the upstate rural economy is where New York State got the money to bail out New York City from its financial bankruptcy. Okay? Now New York City is an economic engine, and this is just my own personal commentary now. It's time to return the favor, because we need an economic development plan that's a little more comprehensive than simply, let's put a casino in every county and I'll give you my pocket change and you give me yours. Okay? It's different when you either go to Vegas or Atlantic City. They make money because they were the only games on their coasts. Now we have them all over the place, and it's just redistribution of dispensable income, I guess is the way that you put it. So we've lost money, we've lost people. We also have a political situation, and this is not partisan commentary, but it is political commentary, okay? We don't have a statewide leader north of the Tappan Zee Bridge, except for the lieutenant governor, which is a ceremonial position. Okay? The state controller, the attorney general, the leaders of both houses, and the governor are all from south of the Tappan Zee Bridge. Tappan Zee Bridge is the Hudson River. So all you've got below it is New York City and Long Island. So if you look at a map, that's beyond inequitable. It's on a map of New York State, that's this much area in a state that would be this big in comparison. Okay? So how do you transmit the needs and the issues and the challenges that we're facing and get policy changes made? Well, that's not the end of the problem. The rest of the problem is that million population loss, that million person population loss, is about to be documented in that census, and then New York State will draw the new district lines for legislative districts for the next 10 years. New York City has gained in population. Rural areas have lost the equivalent of 8 senatorial districts. Okay? Who's going to be there? Now, here's the other issue, and you actually have an anomaly in your area. In most of rural New York, in the Senate, those district lines were drawn by a Republican majority. In the Assembly, they were drawn by a Democratic majority. And the governor has shifted back and forth. The last 2 times we've done it, we've had a Democrat and we've had a Republican in the governor's mansion at the time. And so it was not a bipartisan issue, but it involved both parties in the drawing of the lines. And what largely happens is the Republicans in the Senate make sure that they've made sure that they keep their legislative districts intact and that they keep getting reelected in their area. Same thing happens in the Assembly. Now one party controls both houses and the governor's mansion. Okay? So one party, and that party, statistically, does not represent rural New York. The party that traditionally, historically, has represented rural New York is now in the minority in both houses and is not in the governor's office. Okay? Which makes it particularly challenging because the way that many rural schools in particular and many rural communities have dealt with the loss of or the economic decline in the area has been through legislative member item funding. We can't afford our Little League anymore, but good old Senator so-and-so will give us $10,000 and that'll keep us from going under for the next couple of years. That doesn't happen anymore because the majority in both houses control that pot of money. Okay? So we now have the challenge of making sure that, and again, I'm speaking writ large here, not in individual legislators' cases, because there are very dramatic anomalies. One, Senator Metzger, who is a freshman and part of that new Democratic majority, has been strident in advocating on behalf of rural communities. She's only got a couple, but she sat through 8 hours of a rural broadband hearing and was taking the companies to task for what they haven't done to date, and I've seen her on other issues. So you can have people who are doing this out of altruism, but there are very few legislators who are politically tied that their communities are now going to have issues heard in the conferences that are making the policies in their house. You know, I used to be in those conferences, and as staff people, we would get up and we'd explain the issue, and they'd all understand the issue. But there's an old saying by FDR that said, "You've convinced me, now go out and make me." And we have to recognize, I think, in public education that this state sacrifices an amazing amount in order to support public education. For years now, the rest of the state budget has been frozen in order to pay for two things: healthcare and public education, to make sure that the increases continue. As insignificant as we find those increases to be sometimes, it's the only area that's been allowed to increase in the budget. And we spend, as New York State, we spend more than, get ready for this one, the United States of America. We spend more in New York State than the federal government spends on public education, by about $5 billion. We spend more on public education in this state than 25% of the countries on the planet have as a gross domestic product. It's an astronomical amount of money. And yet, it's not enough, because we have the worst distribution system acknowledged by virtually everybody, because we depend largely about 2/3 on local revenue to pay for that, as opposed to state revenue. And that's opposite of most states. Most states, it's about 2/3 state, 1/3 local. We're about the reverse. And so your zip code largely determines what kind of education you have. Albany doesn't recognize that we have an educational crisis because we graduate everybody. Why would they focus on rural schools that graduate more than 90% of their kids when they've got a Rochester over there that doesn't graduate 50% of their kids? That's obviously where we should focus our efforts, right? Yeah, not so fast. Rural kids all graduate. 2 years later, 75% of them have dropped out of either a 2-year or a 4-year program. 3 out of every 4. Well, why would that be? Well, there are 3 basic reasons. One is, and my own son is the perfect example of this, Danny, you're okay, Tamarack's not, his high school. You got A's, but you got A's in courses that were about this wide, the bare minimum that the state requires for graduation. And we're going to put you, as Ithaca College told him, we're going to put you in classes with kids who have had a curriculum this broad. And you're going to have no context in which to put the information that we give you. So from the first day, you're going to be scrambling to make sense of what we're telling you while they get it and they move on and you're trying to catch up. So that's what happens to our rural kids. And they don't have the guidance counselors, they don't have the people to figure out the student aid, the transportation, all of those issues, and they end up going and taking remedial classes at 2- and 4-year programs, and it just gets too hard. They've got no help, they've got no guidance, and they've got no money in order to do it, and it just gets too hard. Okay? Lots of solutions there. You know, there's digital learning, there's regionalism, there's working with the community colleges for dual enrollment. There are a lot of things that people are doing in community schools. But that's the situation that we're in. We're not serving our kids right now. We're trying really hard. And we're coming out of this economic recession, and the state is starting to provide more resources after it had taken money back from schools during the recession. And we're about even from where we should have been about a decade ago. And we haven't done anything about the state aid formula that actually got worse last year. You know, I got saved. The way that I've described the state aid formula, and I'm one of the few people who has literally seen it worked. My office was next to Jeff Lovell, who did it for the governor for years. And I've actually seen him. It was about a room this size, full of nothing but paper. And Jeff would start over here, and he'd have the number that Senator so-and-so needed for a school district. And I came in, this is about 3 o'clock in the morning, and I came in and watched him start from there and work his way around. said, Jeff, what in the world are you doing? It's 3 o'clock in the morning, right? He said, Senator so-and-so needs that district to get that amount of money. I'm working the formula backwards to see what I have to put in on that side to make that number come out right. Okay? That's a corrupt formula. Okay? The word that I've been using for years is bastardized, and somebody said corrupted last night. I said, perfect. That's such a better word than I was using. But, so now, we've had a formula that's been in place for 10 years that we've frozen, we've cut, we've ignored, and we've corrupted. Less than half of our school districts are on that formula. Half of our school districts aren't on the formula at all. They simply get a percent or 1.5% above whatever they got last year. Okay? That's to make sure that nobody loses. And then we make sure that Long Island gets 12.8% and New York City gets 38% and the rest of the state. So we have these shares. And then we have things outside the formula. The governor's got a couple $300 million in grant programs that's outside the formula. We've got all of our reimbursable expenses, BOCES, transportation, special ed, building aid. All of that takes up $300 and some million to $400 million every year before we ever get into the formula. So when you, you know, it's, I forget who said it, you know, but $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about real money. You know, 100 million here, 100 million there. We don't have a lot of money when it's all said and done. It doesn't come out into a way that school districts have to be able to address the individual challenges that they have. So all of that to make sure that, you know, you aren't doing this with the pencil. You know, all of that is to say, your reason for being here is to tell me the challenges so that we can record the challenges, so that we can put those into a usable format for our state leaders and try and provide them with some answers on how to address something that's been a really intractable issue for a long time now. People have said, the Senate right now, actually both houses, because the Assembly followed suit just last week, they're starting to have hearings on the state aid formula now. I got really vocal last spring because I said, not only did you not fix the formula last year as you promised, but you aren't doing any of the homework that you've got to do in order to do it next year either. You can't just change a 76-page formula when there are that many political and economic implications. You've got to get experts, and you've got to have hearings, and you've got to do costing out studies, and nobody had done any of that work. So I was waiting for this coming January to roll around and have them throw up their hands and say, you know, and all of this is in a context of, you know, the one thing that Governor Cuomo has said to me in the last few years. I was at a reception and I said, I'd really be remiss if I didn't talk to you about the state aid formula. And he leaned in and said, Dave, it's beyond me. It's an honest answer. And I understand why it's beyond him. It's 76 pages long, and it's not legitimate. You're trying to address political issues with money, right? And I guess the most vivid example of that is, not only did the formula not play out as it should last year, but the legislature added 14 new categories to make sure that they could direct money outside the formula to where they believed that it needed to go. For example, Tier A, the biggest tier within that new 14-tiered system that's outside the formula, had $178 million in it. New York City got $176 million of that money. You know, we're fond of saying, and it's true, 70% of the new money that we have goes to high-need districts. What is unsaid in that sentence is that New York City is a high-need district and gets more than half of that money. Okay? Not that they don't need it. They're gaining kids. And our system is based on per child. The exact opposite is happening in our rural areas. We actually look on paper, on the formula, like we're getting wealthier. How can that possibly be when we're getting dramatically more impoverished? Well, it's simple. It's called the combined wealth ratio, and the combined wealth ratio says this is how much property wealth you have, this is how much income wealth you have, and we're going to divide that by the number of kids to tell you how much is behind each kid. Well, you take away a third of those kids, and that number per child gets bigger almost no matter how much the rest of it has declined. And the formula is comparative. You don't have to, you know, if you get poorer, you're supposed to get more money. But you have to not only be poorer, but you have to be poorer than everybody else is getting poorer. And during the recession, everybody got poorer. Right? So we aren't distributing the money according to actual need. We're doing the best we can with what we've got. Okay? So if there's going to be a major effort to try and change the state aid formula, if there's going to be a major effort to try and return rural New York back to the state that it was in, where we can contribute to the family of New York again, even able to bail out our brothers and sisters in urban areas when needed, we've got to pay some attention to the economic development and the school aid formula, which is, let's face it, the schools are an economic engine in many of their communities. So we've got to do all of that in kind of a comprehensive fashion if we want to get out of this thing. So the first thing to do is to try and identify the types of challenges that we're facing so that we know what to address. It's simple to be able to say, well, if we've got fewer students, let's not use a student count as the way that we distribute the formula anymore. Well, that makes sense. So you could say, let's do it based on poverty, okay? Because we're dramatically more impoverished. That's obviously legitimate. Let's have a factor in there for English language learners, or a factor for transients. What do we do when you've set your budget, you've got maybe $50,000, $60,000 that you've been able to raise from one year to another under your tax cap, and then because of transients, some kids' residency changes. All of a sudden, mom's got an opioid issue and she's in rehab, and the kids are staying with grandma. So they're not in this district anymore, and you just got 3 high-need, high-cost special ed kids, and you're trying to figure out whether music or art has to go now. Because in many rural schools, that's how it plays out, because there's no cushion. We haven't recognized a cushion. Rural schools last year spent 3 times their reserves, the money they had in reserves, than all other schools. And they taxed their localities half as much. Localities taxed it over, the tax cap was a little over 2% this past year, and they taxed it a little over 2%. Rural schools taxed at 1%. Why? Because they know there's nothing left to tax, and the last thing you want to do is drive out the few remaining people you've got. Right? That's why I said, take the cutlery, right, before people hurt themselves. But New York State's always had one thing. New York State has always recovered. If you go from, first it was the best port in the world, and then the best river system in the world, and then the Erie Canal, and then the Industrial Revolution, and then Wall Street. There's always been something that has allowed New York State to continue to be the empire state. And we're in that flux period, and we've had dozens of flux periods over our history. But the thing that's always carried us from one to the next has been public education. If I've got a business, I know if I come to New York, the people that I can get to work for me are, in general, more highly educated and able to adapt better than in other states. It's why our kids leave, because there are opportunities out there, because the Regents diploma, even if all you've got is a high school diploma, that's worth more in other states. They recognize that. Okay? And they know their own kids will get a sound education, or at least have always held that in the past. Those things are in jeopardy, at least in our rural areas. And so, and I would say in many of our urban areas as well. One thing that I've learned on this little road show around the state of listening to rural people is how identical our issues are to urban problems. We've got the same issues. What are kids doing after school? What kind of after-school opportunities do you have for school? What kind of transportation issues do you have? What kind of truancy issues do you have? All of those things seem to be completely different reasons for them, but they play out in the same way. Really interesting. So, with that diatribe bludgeoning you, sorry about that, let's hear, we've got a phenomenal array of people here tonight, and the one person that I do want to acknowledge is, as long as we're here, and I want to make sure I had the middle name right. Tammy Bell Martin is here from NYSER, and NYSER is actually underwriting my travel to go around to do this. They really believe in the concept of trying to get this together and addressing these issues. And she's with the Northern Insuring Agency, which is the certified rep for NYSER, and she's here tonight, so thank you for being here. For being part of it. And we've got higher ed reps here, we've got municipal leaders here, we've got state leaders here, we've got SED leaders here, we've got a lot, there's a lot of brain power in this room. And so I'd really like to hear about the issues and challenges that you're facing. I may give you a running commentary back and forth as we do that to tell you some of the things that I've heard elsewhere and how it's played out, and we'll try and get them recorded so that they all get put into the effort to try and get them fixed. So, what's making your lives miserable? I can give you a list. The first one of these, the first one of these I did was at the National Superintendent's Conference, and we just handed out sticky pad notes, little sticky notes, you know, and we said, just put an issue you've got on it. And I gave them 2 minutes, and I came back with this massive thing that was they couldn't write fast enough, you know, so they're out there. So which ones are the worst for you?
David, I just have one question
Yeah.
before you carry on.
Mm.
You were saying that state aid only covers 1/3 of the revenue coming into a school district? That's the way I understood it, and I can't believe that.
It's about 38%, so I exaggerated a little bit.
Okay,
Then federal aid is about 7 to 8%,
yeah,
and the rest is local.
local taxes.
Yeah. And the formula takes up to 3 years to recognize changes in economic circumstance on its best day. And so when IBM leaves you, or a power plant leaves you, and half of your tax base walks away, the state aid on that doesn't catch up for about 3 years. Okay, so how does that play out? Go ahead.
I probably have the least to say in the whole room, but I'll go first. I actually represent a community-based organization that has a contract with New York State Department of Ed to work with all the schools in our region. And something that I've seen play out, I'm married to a teacher of many years' experience. I go to school board meetings, I go around to places, and we find ourselves as a community-based organization in the same situation that I see lots of schools. This one particular thing, which is those of us who work with the state for either reimbursable aid or reimbursable contract work, who get hung up because it takes forever for New York State Education to pay us after we have laid money out. And you said it yourself, school districts don't have a cushion. And if they're hung up for a year with reimbursable aid, that's something that they built into their budgets, or an agency like ours, if it takes 6 or 8 months before we get reimbursement, we're all in a situation where we're starting to cut things or have to lay people off. And I think that's a really big issue because we don't understand on the local level why it takes so long when the money's been budgeted, the money's been promised to us, we do the work, and then we don't get the reimbursement.
It takes so
And
long.
it threatens people.
It takes so long for a couple of reasons. The most important reason is that
It's my point.
SED has been decimated in terms of staffing. So the people who used to be there to do that, to evaluate things, to process things, the biggest school district complaint usually is that how long it takes them to get a building project approved, that it may take them more than a year. And so you go to your public and you ask them, will you give us this much money to build this project? And by the time it gets approved, you can't build it for that anymore. And so you have to start the program, you have to start the process over again. Well, that's not the only office at SED that has significant staffing problems. And they've got some internal problems now. You may have seen that they're having first the commissioner and then several deputies, and they've got some real turnover and issue there. So that, yeah, you're right, that's definitely an issue. Go ahead.
I brought my list. I'm
Okay.
Patricia Ventaquattro. I'm actually a parent tonight, not a teacher. So there's a few things. First.
You can be both. You're allowed to be
Well,
both.
it gets a little touchy sometimes.
Okay.
So you address the loss of our youth, but you failed to address that our retired people are also migrating. So you're losing both ends. The second is the IJC 2014 plan. Lake Ontario, St. Lawrence River, all the flooding, we've lost huge amounts of tax revenue because of tourism loss, people not coming to use that corridor that has typically produced millions of dollars for our state. Rooftop highway. We have a huge problem getting goods and services from Malone to Watertown. There are certain times of day that you drive between Potsdam and Canton, and it is hairy and scary. People are passing on the left, trying to make turns. It's crazy. We need to address this. We don't need a study. We need a shovel in the ground. Fourth, industrial wind. There's a huge conflict. We've had neighbor against neighbor. I'm not sure where that's going, but there are huge problems within our small communities with that. Yes, the jobs, no jobs. In fact,
I'm not understanding the last one yet.
industrial wind, the towers that are being built. We just had a vote in the town of Burke, that's where I live. People against people that have been neighbors for generations aren't talking to each other.
They're split over the development?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, and I'm not taking either side, I'm just saying that that is a community problem, where you would have neighbors helping, willing to help each other, now some don't talk to each other. So that is a community problem. Back to the jobs. I work in healthcare. You used to be able to tell kids, go get a job in healthcare because you'll have a job forever. We have all come under the umbrella of UVM, which is fabulous because we get doctors where we never had doctors before. But we are seeing the loss of professional jobs, LPN, RN jobs, where you would never see these positions cut, gone. Another issue.
Just a function of the industry, of consolidation of the industry?
Absolutely. So it's the migration as well as what's left. So we really need jobs. We really need to be able to move goods and services back and forth. And we have brilliant kids in Northern New York. I want to put a shout out, I don't know who's from Peru here, but Roger Dizotel did a research project last year. He's figured out the plastic straw problem. So he went to a competition, took silver, international, 79 different countries, did a fabulous job. So just a shout out to whoever's doing science at Peru.
Sable, you know Sable.
Sable, thank you. Shout out to Sable. Great kid.
It's like, I'll save them.
Thank you.
Great, thank
That's
you.
it, but
I
he's a great
appreciate
kid.
it, thank you.
Thanks.
Awesome. Others? Yeah.
I'm gonna just add to what she was saying in the sense of, we have mental health issues in rural areas, and it's almost like people don't think we do, because we can't retain staffing to support those mental health issues. So I'll say this as both an educator and a parent. My child who received services has had 4 different counselors in the last year, 2 of whom have migrated to Albany, and 2 of whom turned out not to be certified enough, but they thought they could get it through, to see children. And it's really, and so we have kids coming to school in trauma, and we're doing the best we can with what we've got, but we don't have enough services to wrap around the family, to wrap around the children. The school can't do it all in a 7-hour day, or 6 1/4, depending on how long your day is. And right now we're being expected to.
Over and over again, on different surveys and things, mental health comes up the #1 issue for schools. Yeah.
I was a school board president for a number of years, and one of the issues we faced then, budgetary, and it's not necessarily how much money you get, it's how you can use the money that you get. They silo a lot of it. You can't move money that maybe in one school would make some sense, but in another school maybe it doesn't make any sense, but you got these one-size-fits-all rules. So maybe if there's some flexibility in how you could get your money and how you could use it, some more flexibility would be better. One of the other issues we faced at one time was we had built up what we thought was a reasonable rainy day fund. But of course, New York State comes in and tells you, that's too much money, you gotta spend it, you gotta spend it, you gotta spend it. Well, we knew as local leaders that we were gonna have an issue with the closing of a plant, that money was gonna go away. We needed that money to carry us through some rough times. But no, you can't have it, so the comptroller comes in and says, no, you gotta spend that money down, give it back to the taxpayers, whatever, which makes some sense, I understand that. But I guess my comment is, through foundation aid or whatever, the way they're locked in, I think it's still somewhat true that there's little flexibility there to use money that would benefit your school district.
It's why we spend so much time talking about foundation aid, operating aid, because that's the flexible category. But you're right, as I said, by the time you get the grants taken out and you get the reimbursable formulas taken out, which are things that the school district has fronted money for and is waiting for reimbursement on, there's not a whole lot left. State has been responsive of late on a couple of things. This past year, they passed a teacher's retirement system reserve. Non-instructional employees always had a reserve fund in the school before, and the reason, not because the state had been particularly concerned about providing it to school employees, but because they provided it to all municipal employees, and school districts are municipalities, so non-instructional staff in the school are, under the law, municipal employees, and they're in the state retirement system. So when they provided it for the state retirement system, you were allowed to put money away to try and smooth over the spikes. You know, when David Patterson was governor, you know, he's basically sightless, and I had been going around the state saying that that we couldn't have state aid that went like this when school costs go like this. Well, when I met with David Patterson, I obviously couldn't do that. I couldn't tell it that way. So I said, you know, we couldn't have state aid that looked like an EKG chart when we have expenses that look like a handicap ramp. Okay. So he turned to my boss and goes, he's very good, never bring him again. So, but it's very true. This past year, they just allowed us for the first time to set up reserves for our teachers as well. And always in the past, you know, I tried all the time I was at NYSBA for 15 years to try and get that done. And the knock on it was always that schools would take that money and, you know, squirrel that money away and jack up taxes. And so they didn't do it to try and restrain the taxes. Well, that argument went away when we got consistent years under the tax cap of 0, 0, and 0.1, that type of thing. So it wasn't possible to do that. And it never was the way that schools did it. I mean, the way you always ended up at the end of the year with, you know, with a surplus was you had fewer kids in a high-cost program than you anticipated. More people retired than you anticipated, those types of things. They were end-of-the-year decisions, not part of your general fiscal plan. But the state has been responsive in that way to allow more flexibility, largely because they recognize that there is volatility in state aid. If we, you know, our economy, you know, is like a wave, and we've crested, and everybody's kind of waiting for the wave to start to go down right now, and so they're hedging a little bit. In fact, under the retirement system, they do a 5-year average of costs, and they've just increased the costs because some of those 5-year averages are coming out and high-cost years are coming in. So recognize it. Yeah, just a second. Go ahead.
On the same issue that Mark was just talking about, David, you mentioned foundation aid, and we all, maybe many of us use the term usable, that's our usable state aid. But I just want to remind everybody, for the last 3 years, we've been seeing more action coming in from Albany with these set-asides, meaning here's the foundation aid that a formula or a legislative move says you should have, but now that's coming with mandates. Well, you can only use it for this, or you can only use it for that. The community schools program, while really well-intended, I just want to caution everybody, that's not new money for a school. I'm sorry, it's not. That's part of the foundation aid, and I'm glad to see a few intelligent heads shaking yes on this one. That's not new money. That is foundation aid money that we are owed by the formula or whatever's out there. Now we're being told where it goes. So I'm hoping that's not the advent of the even more erosion of local control. But when we talk about usable foundation aid, we're careful in Shazy, the Shazy Central Rural School, noted historically as the first rural school in the United States of America. We,
Us, Abel.
I gotta get one in too. We're careful about that. Second of all, it seems the tax cap is, and Mark also talked about the tax cap. It seems that legislatively speaking, the tax cap is not going away. Just want to remind everyone that towns, counties, and villages can decide through their process to exceed the tax cap. I think we just saw an article locally that a municipality is coming in under the cap. That's great. For the public schools, it's an act of Congress. It's a gamble. It's quite an endeavor to convince the community, many in this demographic on a fixed income, to the white widow with a humongous house with 5 kids that are out of school. I can't do anything more in my school budget, so you got to pay more taxes. It's a very big gamble for the public schools to have to do that. So I would like to see some change, even within the tax cap. It's not going away. I personally accept that. We as a planning team accept that. But let's see some flexibility in those rules. Thanks.
There's some common sense things under the cap, obviously, that should be addressed. Some districts, it's possible to have a negative tax cap. It's possible to go into the red, by design. That's an odd way to operate a public entity when the state has the constitutional responsibility to provide that education. You had a comment.
I'm with the communications poster at CVES BOCES, and one of the things that I find our districts are faced with is a geographical and economic issue, and making sure that we can get information out to the public. And of course, we're dealing with 3 generations of people who have different needs when we receive their communications. You've got people who prefer print communications, you've got people who are very tied to social media communications, and you've got people who prefer emails or apps. Apps are the new thing now coming down the pipe for the younger parents in my generation that are now coming into school districts. And economically, not everybody can afford computers and be on their devices. They still want to receive paper at home, or they don't have access to broadband internet where they can receive the documentations and things like that. And then, of course, when you're forced to default to your cell phone to get materials, then we don't have enough cellular coverage in certain areas so that people can get the stuff they're trying to pull down off of their websites. I saw somebody today had a complaint that they wanted to know if a form or a survey that was being done online was going to be available in paper for them to submit back to the school district because they can't obtain it online or access it the way that the school district would like them to interact with. So I think a lot of rural school districts are probably dealing with a barrier in communications when they're faced with having to meet 3 different generational needs in communication, and then on top of that, there's gaps in the infrastructure of our area that is not being met. We've been promised broadband forever, and there's still whole areas in the North Country with no broadband internet whatsoever. And we recently had one broadband organizations was, I think, a claim filed against them for improperly making promises or didn't come through on a state contract, and that happened a little further west.
Broadband, you don't have cell areas. You got me in trouble with my wife. You didn't answer my text. Well,
Yeah, so.
I didn't get it until I got to it.
So that, as a communications officer for several school districts, I see that as a big problem for districts, trying to meet those needs of their constituents and their stakeholders, not getting information and not getting it in the fashion that they want, and in a timely fashion to start too.
Legislature's trying to address that. They held an 8-hour hearing. The Legislative Commission on Rural Resources and the Assembly Local Government Committee came together to talk about the rural broadband issue. 8 hours long of testimony, and I sat through the entire thing, and the state did a really good job. The Public Service Commission and the legislators did a really good job of identifying the deficiencies that have happened so far. Charter Communications, Frontier, they both had massive issues. They've over-reported their coverage. They have these census blocks, they call them, and it's an area, and they've been counting that entire census block as being covered if anyone within the census block was covered.
Oh my Lord.
Right, which is why you have these massive gaps in coverage. The thing that I testified about at the end of the day was the fact that in the 7.5 hours until I got to testify, I hadn't heard anything about the most dynamic thing happening in rural broadband that I've heard about recently. Sprint and T-Mobile, Sprint's got the infrastructure and T-Mobile has the customer base. They applied to the FCC, the federal government, to merge specifically for the purpose, and they've supplied enforceable and verifiable contracts showing the only reason they're doing this is to provide rural broadband. Okay, a 5G network for rural broadband across America, right? The FCC approved it, the Department of Justice approved it, New York's Attorney General is suing them to prevent it because they believe that it will result in a lack of competition. Okay? I would rather worry about a lack of competition once you have the service at all, as opposed to the very first meeting I ever went to as local government counsel in the Senate was a meeting with the industry about cell towers. Everybody was concerned about the unsightly nature of cell towers. Okay, and the industry rep said, don't worry about it, they'll be gone in 20 years because we have this new system called 5G and all those transmitters will be little tiny things stuck on every telephone pole around. That's 5G. Now we're 40 years, 30 years later. We're still waiting for it. And what they said at the hearing was that the public utilities are requiring a contract for each and every one of those telephone poles. We've got to be out of our minds. You know, I mean, the economic deterrent to investing in rural areas, and that's what's keeping it from us, not the technology. We have the technology. We even have the money and the investment, the people willing to invest to do it. And we don't have it together enough to try and pull it off. I wanted to get back because I had a reaction to your comment too, because I've seen that over and over again. You bring in your own auditor to do an audit, and they will tell you you don't have enough in reserve. School districts are municipalities, right? For all other municipalities, the amount that we're limited to, the 4% that we're of reserves that we're limited to, is statutory fiscal distress for all other municipalities. And it's the reason that it's there is because the state has the constitutional obligation to provide a sound basic education, in essence saying that you're limited, but the state will underwrite that effort, because despite the fact that we like to talk about local control, we have local control because the state has determined that that's the best way to uphold their obligation under the Constitution. So there's this implied contract that they will underwrite. You've only got this much to work with, but we're underwriting, we won't let you go under. And they haven't let anybody go under. There's no school district that's gone under. There are school districts that aren't providing the required basic education. They've gone under educationally, but not financially. So you can have your own auditor come in and say, you guys are crazy. You've only got 5% in reserve when it's so volatile in terms of state aid. And then you have the state controller that comes in and says, you're over the limit, you've got too much money. It's really an odd circumstance. Yeah.
Michael Cashman, Plattsburgh Town Supervisor. I want to pitch a couple of different things that are pretty much in the same bucket, but slightly off. And that's shared services goes back as far as the handshake of two farmers in the field. And there's a lot of emphasis on that. It's what we're already doing. But I don't think that the school districts have been allowed a seat at the table for the various shared services programs that are expected of municipalities at the local level. Consortiums for healthcare and various things with some of the towns, the cities, the villages. I'm not saying that there's a simple answer there, but we need to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to get to the table to have some of those similar conversations.
There are some impediments. IDAs.
Be careful.
I
We talk about shared services in school districts, you're gonna talk about combination of school districts, you're gonna talk about kids traveling on buses for 2.5 hours
But I'm
each way.
I'm talking more with the local municipalities.
Oh, okay.
There are opportunities with the municipalities to do things. Bus maintenance, maybe one.
No, I agree with
as
you.
an example. So there's certain things that should stay within the bucket, but and one of the reasons that I bring this up is one of the largest employers in rural America tends to be government. Okay, and we are seeing a mass aging in the public sector. And if we don't have the A and B squad working in government, you're gonna have the D&E squad working on your water infrastructure, and your roads, and your health and safety within your communities. So we have to make sure that the public sector is as valued by the next generation of students coming up as well. And you have to find those opportunities to bring them together.
There's a huge civics gap, Art, and largely, we can't blame this one on anybody but ourselves. Last 10 years, we've emphasized STEM, and at the same time that we've contracted our resources, and so we contracted them largely away from civics.
Elsewhere.
You know, and so it's tough to convince people that public service is a career. I do want to say one thing about shared services. This is the Cornell side of me. We're also the rural schools program at Cornell, and so every once in a while I get information out of Cornell, one of which is Dr. Mildred Warner, who's the world's foremost authority on shared municipal services. And Dr. Warner will tell you that the epicenter of shared services globally is right here. It's upstate New York. Nobody shares services like, and it's exactly what you talk about. The school will let the town have a youth program on their athletic fields in the summer in exchange for the town plowing the parking lot in the winter, right? And the county and the school district might share either a bus garage or a fueling station because they've all got the same type of diesel things to run. All of these things, handshake agreements to formal agreements, and then you layer on top of that a financially incentivized program in BOCES for instructional services if you agree to share them, right? So we have an infrastructure in place to be able to maximize that. You've got a paper here on one of the things that's on the bottom that talks about the issue that Billy brings up, merger and consolidation. Merger and consolidation, you have one of the only successful mergers and consolidations of late. And sometimes it's the answer. In other places, and it's not, you know, everybody's got the idea that my kid's not playing for my old rival. You know, we're not combining with it. It's really much more practical than that. My school district and your school district have got two different tax rates, okay? And after that 10 years of state aid for incentivized merger and consolidation aid, unless you've squirreled that money away somehow, and you can't for the very reason that you were talking about, you've used that money, and all of a sudden people's tax rates are altered as a result of the merger and consolidation. Mid-1970s, I went to a regional high school. Okay, I went to one in Illinois, run by the State College, and I went to one in Connecticut, well, I guess that was too, run by UConn. We haven't figured that out in New York yet, that you can keep the elementary school and you can keep the middle school and all the value that the school has within the community, and then when kids can ride a little longer on the bus, they can go to a regional facility where a broader curriculum can be offered, and every teacher that you had before, you know, and I've talked to Dan Kinley from NYSET about this, because Dan would say, we don't like regional schools because you're going to lose staff. You're not going to lose staff. We've lost 10,000 teachers out of rural New York. How many more do you think we can possibly lose, right? What we need are those teachers reassigned to provide the broad enough curriculum so that our kids can do something with it afterwards, right? So there are some things, you know, that are possible. The shared services that you talk about they should be a matter of course.
But there's too many firewalls in between the local town, village, city, municipalities, and the school district, and BOCES and such, okay, for purchasing power, for instance. We cannot piggyback on some of the contracts. That's ridiculous.
No, you can't.
In some cases, there are firewalls that prevent you
Because
from
I wrote the
piggybacking.
law that says you can. I know that one.
But some of them.
You couldn't for generations.
There are fine lines though once you get into it. And so.
Well, OGS always had the state contract, and they were tremendously resistant to being able to generalize piggybacking because it made them obsolete, in essence. So there are some specific areas where you can't, but generally, you can try and do that. Yeah. But
I just want to piggyback on what, I agree with Michael on that completely, and I believe Chateaugay Central, back when I was with the village of Chateaugay, we did consolidation of the fuel station, and more of that should be done. I think that helps. What I was trying to say is, in many of our very small rural, and I'm talking rural school districts here in the Adirondacks, sometimes, and we have a classic example, and I give Mark a lot of credit for the merger with Elizabethtown that's been successful, but sometimes that's just not an option. I mean, we have areas in the North Country right now where kids are on the bus for an hour each way, an hour and a half each way. Consolidation, yeah, that's great. We'll just consolidate it. We'll get 30 kids, 20 kids in this classroom instead of 7 or 8. Those kids literally are, you're covering 1,000 square miles. You're covering, those kids are going to be on the bus for 3 hours in a day. You can't have that. So that's the kind of merging and consolidation that I get nervous about when we talk about shared services and we talk about some of these things. I'm all for shared services. We've been doing shared services in the North Country before, whatever he said. The farmer shook the hand or whatever. And I'm picking on him a little bit. But now we have a system where counties have to, and Mark knows about this, and towns have to, and they have to document all that, and they can't go back and document what they've been doing for years past. I just get very nervous when we get to that level of, you know, let us do the shared services, but let us do it what's right for us here in the North Country or in rural areas in New York. I just don't want to get us, don't let somebody get an idea that might be transferable into a bad idea for us here.
Don't leave here without picking up that document on merger and consolidation. I absolutely agree with you. The governor floated it last year.
Because that's the direction that he will head in, is what I'm nervous about.
Here's the idea. He says, we've got, you know, all of these school districts out there, and they're not providing the array of curriculum. They've got too much administration, we need to merge them. No, for exactly the reason that Billy says. The example I always use is Newcomb. They wanted to merge. Who are you going to merge with? Mermaids in the lake? You know? Or the dwarfs that live in the mountains next to you? You know, I mean, if you shut down every time you had to go over the mountains in the winter because you've merged with your neighbor on that side of the, you'll never have school. You know, I mean, they go to the extent of bringing in international students just to have the critical mass to be able to do a school play or that type of thing. You know, I absolutely understand what you're saying. I also know that politically, no state leader wants to get in front of that. You know how contentious that is. Nobody wants to get in front of, you have to merge, because you know where merger and consolidation makes sense? Long Island. Why would you merge up here? Merge on Long Island where you've got 120 miles and 127 school districts. Right? I can stand on a corner and hit 4 school districts with a rock. Why in the world would they all exist out there? It's because every town's got their own school.
And they've been getting all that Senate money for a number of years, so they can do it.
Well, and honestly, if you want to have a little side political discussion, it's because Long Island has flip-flopped 3 different times now in 4 elections, and it's changed the majority twice, right? And it's largely because you haven't done enough for me to keep my property taxes down, and so I'll get somebody who can, right? And they can't afford to lose that majority this next time because they want to be empowered to write those new district lines that will ensure that they stay there for a while. So, you know, I don't think anybody wants to get in front of merger and consolidation, but we've got a system now that almost prevents it. I mean, statutorily prevents it. Where in democracy do you have 4 different votes? You've got to get a positive vote of both school boards. You've got to get a positive vote of both communities. You've got to have a study. Then you got to go back and have a final vote in both places. Why in the world wouldn't you have a positive vote of both elected school boards and then one generalized vote for the area that says this is what we need? You know, I understand people have, you've got legitimate financial concerns and you've got cultural concerns, but this is the very existence of your kids being able to work and live where they grew up. You know, there's some things that we have to zero in on in terms of priorities. Go ahead.
Well, they tend to, every time it seems like a school district figures out a way to save some money, then somebody will come in and tell you, the comptroller's office or somebody will come in and tell you, you can't do that, we won't let you do that, you gotta give it all back or whatever. For example, we have a soccer field in Chazy. there was a little building, a wood, there still is there, a wooden building, where you could come in and the announcers could be, to announce the games. So, we put that up, basically with volunteers, this wooden building. It's about as tall as this room right here, with a window in it about as wide as that screen.
In 100 of them,
Yeah.
I've done a lot of youth
So
sports.
state SED engineers came in and saw that because we were building some other things, and they went, what is that? We said, well, it's just a place where media goes and they can take pictures or whatever. They said, we don't see this on any of your plans. Well, no, it's not on any of our plans. It was built with volunteer labor, and there it is. So they looked at it. Now this thing is, like I said, from the roof, it's 9 feet to the ground.
Go back and do your plan over.
We had a wooden stairway going up. We had to put plans on it. We had to have an engineer look at it. We had to get a metal stairs to go up to it because wooden stairs might burn down. You could jump out the window. I could jump out the window and do it. I mean, it's just, it's ridiculous the amount of micromanagement they have on this. Now, I get it if you're building a school building, if you're putting a roof on. But who in their right mind and anywhere would care about a building that small? Wanted to build bathrooms. I forget what the price was going to be on the bathrooms, but the way they designed it, it was going to be a fortune. It was going to be more than a soccer field to put bathrooms out there the way they wanted it done. I think a lot of it is regulation. And it seems to come every time you figure out a way to make things a little better, save a little money, do a new program, you can't get it done.
It reminds me of state troopers and radar detectors. I put a radar detector in my car. They build a new kind of radar that beats my radar detector. You know, so I go out and get a new one and that meets that one, and now they've got a laser that my radar detector tells me I've just been caught. That's the value of the radar detector. You know, you've got this back and forth thing all the time. One of the things I would suggest to you that would be helpful to try and advocate for, specifically to that, is design build. You know, SED's got a room full of approved plans, and we can't use them. You've got to go back and start from scratch, and obviously the architectural firms want you to start from scratch, but we've got all of those plans sitting there that have been approved, and architecturally approved, and designs that have been approved, and SED approved. They're all sitting there, right? Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Dan. I'm a special education principal here for CVES, and I'm kind of coming from the perspective on the ground floors. And I'm sure many of us working in the field can attest to this. The biggest challenges that I'm foreseeing right now is I'm not having enough sustainability to maintain my programs. And it's a significant challenge that I find here because of retention of staff, quality of staff to meet the various high needs that we have. Mental health and trauma has really taken a big wave, but we do not have the resources here to support the needs that I find here in the North Country. And with staff retention, we're losing a lot of quality people. And I grew up on Long Island, New York City, so I came up here, went to school, and I stayed up here. So my experience down there has always been you lose people
You came up here to get away from all that.
yeah, kind of. But when you lose people down there, because of the population that you have down there, the amount of time it takes to refill those positions with quality people because of the opportunities you have living close to New York City and all that type of stuff south of the Tappan Zee.
Just the critical mass of people.
It's the mass of people that does that. Coming up here and living in the North Country for almost 10 years now, it's crazy. It's not like that at all here. You lose a good quality teacher, you're lucky to find somebody that can replace and match that level of quality to what you need. And the biggest concern that I'm having, we're having a high increase of needs. And I'm a little tainted because I'm in the special ed world, so I'm having high needs of kids, and I don't have the staffing to maintain the programs, which results in people who get paid like to deal with some really tough kids. They don't want to stay. Then
For the TV people, he said they don't get paid well.
and then the ripple effects of all that comes into play with not able to meet the needs of our kids. That's constantly growing in the region and not able to refill that. So that's something that I see a huge concern in the North Country, and specifically with when someone goes, it's not so easy to refill those positions as it is back downstate.
Let me broaden that out a little bit, because in other forums, it's been one of the most pervasive concerns, teacher recruitment and retention. Rural schools can't get them. You know, And there are a lot of reasons. One is rural schools pay dramatically less than their suburban and urban neighbors. And so it's hard if you're out of school and you want to teach and you've got a boatload of student aid, you got to go someplace. If you're working, you don't get a deferment on that. You need to be paying on that. And it's harder if you're making less and you have others offering more money. So it's hard to get them initially. And then we have just the fact of life, that if I'm 22 and I want to meet somebody and start a family, I'm probably not going someplace where there are 6 people my age. Right? So it's tough. Other states have started to address that in some pretty creative ways. Some of the really rural states have 4-day school weeks. And the reason they have that is not so much just because, they don't have to heat the building on a Friday or something like that, or bring the buses in on a Friday. It's largely because you can get somebody that will live in a suburban area that's willing to commute for those days if they only have a 4-day week, knowing they have a 3-day weekend, they don't have to make that commute as often. Okay, so it's not that they're working less, because you're expanding those 4 days to make up the time. You're working longer, but you're not commuting as much. Other states have used their BOCES career and tech programs. They're building teacher housing, subsidized low-cost teacher housing to bring staff in to the area because they can't find housing. From Long Island, I'll give you the classic example from my forum like this in Riverhead on Long Island. They can't get teachers because nobody can afford to live. You've got rural school districts surrounded by the Hamptons. Where are you going to live? You can't afford that on a teacher's salary. Right? So they're driving an hour and a half, an hour and 45 minutes each way into work every day to be able to work in that school district. And the reason they're willing to do that is to get it on their resume so they can get something that's closer to home, that pays more, that's, Yes, ma'am.
Just to add to what Dan said, and I've overheard this a lot in trying to help promote professional development, is that I hear often that it's hard to get professional development out to our staffing who need it, who want it, because there's also no substitutes to cover their positions while they're out for the day for that professional development. Professional development is costly, and for the districts in some cases, and mostly it's getting them, here in the first place, and they're not able to leave their classrooms because they're needed there because there's not enough people to cover them while they're not there. So, and I'm hearing a lot more and more, and I watched several job boards for several districts on their websites. Substitutes are crazy. There's a big substitute problem. We don't, and it's not appealing to anybody to come to work for $80 or $90 a day, hit or miss, every once in a while. I know of a friend personally that I went to school with. He left the area for a full-time position in Arizona because he was a substitute only in about three districts here and couldn't sustain himself on that.
I'm surprised you could go to Arizona because they're the worst.
It's a regulation problem though with what's required to obtain various types of certification. And then all of the hoops to jump through on top of getting however many credits. And that system hasn't adapted in a long time, like 20-something years. And so it's
one of the reasons why I was led to do this was because last year the Regents floated the idea that all substitutes would have to be certified in the area they were subbing in. I mean, that's as far removed from the rural experience as you could be. So it was obvious that they needed to be informed about what was actually happening out there. Broadening certification areas would certainly be helpful, and allowing for more life experience. The fact that old Mr. Little can teach business for 40 years despite the fact that old Mr. Little never engaged in business, but I took the right courses. Bill Gates can't teach it. Not certified, sorry, can't do it. Yeah, you had.
David, 2 points, just ask you a question as far as rural schools, your support of. One, of course, is the 2% cap tax, because of the issue also is that we're the most limiting in the country when it says 2% or CPI, whatever's less. So we don't have capacity to grow. Up here in the North Country in the last 18 months, we raised health insurance costs by 39%. That doesn't quite equate to what you can do for the expendable income with your 2% cap tax. Any support from rural schools on that one, because that's a major hitter. The other one, to comment on the gentleman's point, is about construction projects. I would really like to have somebody talk to SHPO. SHPO destroys us for the fact that a lot of our buildings up here in the North Country are very old buildings. When you want to make adjustments and you want to make advancements of your district, you have to bring that back to the original state. Very expensive cost when it's not frugal to your taxpayers. And I'll give you an example. You know the glass prisms that you have sometimes for aesthetically looking things above windows? Previous district I was in, we spent almost $600,000 on that because they wanted to bring that back to make it look nice with the 1957 model. Versus efficiencies, and I argued a point, I went to Albany and everything. I mean, anything that we can do as we're moving forward, talking about efficiencies and effectiveness. If it's for aesthetics only, I don't see where that's the best use of taxpayer money.
I've been banging my head on the tax cap issue since it was first enacted, because we took the worst ideas from every state that had a tax cap and put them all in. You know, we had a 2% tax cap, and well, we said Massachusetts has a 2% cap. We should have. Yeah, it's a higher cap, and it's for the municipality, which includes the school district, so you have the capability to allocate within the entire municipal and school environment what you do with that money, and they do a much better job at the state level of filling in the rest. We haven't done the backfilling at the state level, but to your main point, it's 2% or the consumer price index rate, which is absurd, okay? We don't have consumer costs, okay? Now, the argument is, yeah, but your taxpayers do. So this is the rate that your taxpayers are seeing increases in other areas, and you should match that increase. The school district isn't a marketplace. The school district is providing a constitutional function. And you don't say we're suspending freedom of the press or freedom of assembly because we're a little short this month. Okay, you prioritize from other areas for that. You know, the consumer price index, consumers don't run buses 12 hours a day. Consumers don't have liability insurance. I mean, there's a bunch of different costs that school districts simply have that consumers don't. So trying to equate the two and then telling schools because the consumer price index was 0 last year, you also have to be 0. Be brave enough to simply say, we're freezing your costs, cut people. That's what you're saying. We're freezing your costs.
I'm Sylvia Nelson. I represent the North Country Workforce Development Board, and
Yeah.
so the workforce aspect of this discussion tonight. What I find is that although we work in partnership on numerous projects at numerous levels, I mean, Mark is on my speed dial, basically. What I find a challenge from the workforce perspective is that there's a disconnect between education and what's going on, you know, in the workplace. And in that respect is that we have students who have a ton of opportunities within our areas. And because, you know, sometimes the parents and the kids themselves, they drive by these nondescript buildings where really high-tech things are happening. My role is to really try to bridge that gap. And what I find is a lot of times is because of, you know, state mandates are in the way. The kids can't always leave school. There's budgetary issue. There's transportation issues. But the thing is that from my perspective, if we can do a better job into bringing these opportunities and communicating them with the schools, with the students, with the parents, I think that would help us solve part of, not all of it, but part of the solution with the kids leaving the area and things like that, and also with providing them understanding of a good career pathway within our own region.
It's really interesting, you know, statistically, we're losing the middle class. And I think that's playing out exactly in what you're talking about, because you have two sets of community expectations. You've got white-collar parents who don't want their kids becoming a plumber. And you've got lower middle-class parents who have no expectations beyond whatever. I literally, at a forum we had last winter in Lake Placid, I literally had a parent say, I've got a four-wheeler and a, you know, like a, it's not a jet ski, it's whatever it is, snowmobile. I've got a four-wheeler and a snowmobile, and my kid's got a four-wheeler and a snowmobile, and that's all I ever had, and why would he want more than that?
Yeah. On the
I'm
flip
not talking
side,
about his toy choices,
Yeah.
you know, but you have two spectrums of parental expectations. Neither one of them are healthy in this environment,
no,
you know, because the jobs are here,
they are.
right? They're not here right now. They're here. And nobody's thinking. From either end, they're not thinking here.
And that's why I think it's important to come together, and we as a region do a great job. I mean, like I said, I've got partnership, but on that income thing, on the flip side of that, we have salaries that don't meet the requirements of what people need to be able to afford to have a middle-class life. For example, we've got the United Way, the Alice report, asset limited. Thank you. It's basically the working poor. And so from a business perspective, there's that whole gap as well to be able to bridge it so that the people that are getting these jobs can actually make ends meet and not have to be relying on other services to kind of complement when they're fully employed and, you know, and they're trying to make it. So there's that whole aspect of it that's probably another discussion, but it's not all simple. But if we can try to bridge those gaps, to have that communication with the schools, for the kids and the parents to understand opportunities are here now, I think that we would make some headways.
I know exactly what you're talking about. My younger son, the one that I said didn't get into Ithaca, well, he did get into RIT. It took him 5 years to graduate. He's got $100,000 in debt, and he makes $34,000 as a photographer for the Greenfield, Massachusetts Recorder. He has no health insurance. I mean, he's on Massachusetts' version of Medicare because his employer doesn't offer it, and he has no retirement, right? And Dad bought his car for him. Right, or he wouldn't have a way to get around to take the photos. Right? It's just the dichotomy that's, you know, my wife hates when I say this. Everybody says that their kids are their pride and joy, and I say I've got one of each. Danny, the younger one, is the one I just described.
Yeah.
Most joyful kid I ever knew in my life. At 4 years old, I said, "What are you doing, Danny?" And he had a sketch pad, and he was watching a Jetsons cartoon, and he had absolutely perfectly identical figures of all the Jetsons and all the characters in the Jetsons at 4 years old. So I knew he was going to be creative. I just didn't know what form that would take. His older brother he's a personal injury attorney for Celino and Barnes in Rochester. And when I called, last year Danny made $31,000, and he got a $3,000 raise that he was excited about. So I told his big brother, I said, "Danny got a raise. How much? How much does he make now?" $34,000. And there's this long pause, and he said, "I won't call Danny this week." Right? And I said, "Why wouldn't you call him?" And he said, "Because I settled a case this morning, and my cut is more than that." That's the two ends of the spectrum that we've created in our society with nothing in the middle. And my only saving grace, because all this will play out after I'm gone, and it's the best thing Patrick had told me in a long time. He said, "Dad, don't worry about Danny. I fully expect to support him the rest of the life."
Raised and right.
So, Billy, go ahead.
Just one more. I mean, we talked about foundation aid. That's getting to the root of the, you know, the money that most of the superintendents here and the principals and administration in this room talk about, and teachers. Can you, I mean, no offense, I've had many of you in my office in Albany, and I love to hear from you. I've heard most of these issues that we have here in the North Country. I think you know that I listen to that. But every time we try to tackle the formula, okay, get in there, and I'm in that conference, in that majority conference, by the way, and we say we want to tackle the formula. Well, you can't do that because it's going to hurt these school districts. You can't do that because it's going to hurt these people. May help them, but it's going to hurt that school district. So have you guys thought of a formula that helps our rural schools? Because I'm asking this sincerely. I wanna know, because we wanna solve the problem. Because whether you believe it or not, New York State has increased their education, funding around
question.
6% in the last.
Here's the deal.
over
Here's
last
the
year. We
response.
consistently put it up. I just wanna know what the solution is here
Yep.
to get this money to these school districts in a foundation aid formula, or whatever formula we wanna call it, to do it successfully. Or do we just scrap the whole thing and come up with something new? But you know how that goes.
Yeah.
I'm looking for answers here to
Here's
the
the
problems
short
that
one.
these good people have.
The short answer is, not yet. This is part of that process, okay, to figure out what we need to recognize in the formula. The longer answer is, the good news is, you did it once. Post-CFE, the Campaign for Fiscal Equity case,
Yep.
when the state signed off on that and the court ordered that, the state had a formula. Bob Lowry from NISCUS calls it an underappreciated legislative achievement. At the time, and for a couple of years, we had $2 billion increases according to the formula that they created at the time, and it was pretty equitable. It was recognizing what needed to be recognized at the time.
What year was that?
12 years ago, so
2008-ish?
2009, I think.
And something happened
Well,
in 10 or 11 that.
yeah, the Great
changed that?
Recession. The Great Recession is what happened.
Well.
And the state started taking money back from the schools as opposed to upholding the formula. The problem is, the formula now, if you ran the formula, incredibly destructive. Nobody runs the formula. Half of the school districts are on Save Harmless, meaning that they're getting too much money according to the formula. That's what Save Harmless means. And some of our poorest districts are on Save Harmless, so it's incredibly inequitable the way that it's played out. Nobody anticipated the economic circumstances that would immediately follow having done the formula the last time. We have the current formula, that formula recognizes poverty at a level that's it's half again as high as many of our districts actually are. We have school districts that are half again as poor as the formula will recognize. So you can only be so poor. We will only give you money within the formula to address this level of poverty. And many of our rural school districts are below that line now. The formula is also based on students, and we've had tremendous enrollment decline. So you run the formula, and the very people who need the money lose the money, right? Unless if I were doing this kind of thing in New York City, their response would be, so what are you going to do? Take it from us when we gain kids? We've got more kids,
35
and you want to take money from us when we're the ones that are getting more kids? How do we do that? Vermont tried to pull it off, robbing Peter to pay Paul, and it didn't work. I mean, there are a number of states that have tried to do exactly what you suggested people are afraid of in the conference. You've got to take it from here for there. In public education, I really think that sometimes we need a reality check. We need to recognize that when we walk in to talk about something we're passionate about in public education, and knowing how important that is, that the next person walking in may be talking about homeless vets. And the person before you might be talking about housing senior citizens in the middle of winter. Somebody else is talking about keeping the bridges from falling in. There are other legitimate state concerns besides public education. We understand that. On some level, we all understand that. And we also understand that the state spends an inordinate amount of money. I mean, it's an astronomical amount of money already.
Order of their operating budget.
$65 billion. How can you not pull this off for $65 billion? And the fact is that the state of New York layers responsibilities. Rather, if the state of New York passes 5 new mandates this year in the state budget, okay, and says you now have to do this, 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 and this, it never says, so you don't have to do this, 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 and this anymore. It says you've got to do those things in addition, and we're going to give you a little more money to cover the cost. Well, in the last few years, the amount of money, and this goes to Mark's point over here, the amount of money may be designated for other things. The amount of money is probably, as it has been in the last few years, about half of what it simply takes to roll over what you're doing right now from one year to the next. Okay? And I'm not saying, the answer isn't to lift the cap, in my way of thinking. This is my own personal thought now. Because our rural communities have been so decimated, that you're gonna drive everybody else out if you decide we're gonna tax them at 6% instead of at 2%, I'm not living there. We already have the circumstance.
80% of the public doesn't want their taxes to go over the tax cap. I mean, that's
Yeah,
just the
exactly.
number. I mean,
That's why there's very little traction on it. That's why we get these anomalies like a negative tax cap in some year. Why the state won't even recognize what happens when you come off a pilot and what happens with your IDAs and that type of thing. You've got all these things that were never really intended. But I think that the governor believes that giving in on any aspect of that original signature legislation is a loss. It's starting to deteriorate that accomplishment and simply isn't willing to do that. And the fact of the matter is that writ large, our rural schools aren't even taxing at the cap rate. We're taxing at half the cap rate. And we're using up our reserves because we don't want to drive everybody else out. Here's the sad truth. I mean, I hate to say this. We've got the highest taxes in the country. We've got the highest per capita debt level in the country, which ensures high taxes into the future. We've got high heating and cooling costs for any business that wants to come in. We're an old state, so we've got high infrastructure costs that are coming to try and fix the things. We've got high transportation costs because we're up here in the corner. We're a long way from most places that we want to ship to. If I'm 25 years old and I've got student debt, why would I stay here? Why would I accept that high level of debt and high level of tax when I can go places that aren't going to take that from me? So I'll get rid of my student debt faster. I'll have more income, personal income, if I don't stay here. It takes a really altruistic, civic-minded heart to stay here after you get out of school, given those things. But it's home for a lot of people, and people want to be home. And you've got this public educational system that beats almost everybody except Massachusetts, right? So, I mean, those are the things that you've got going for you. So if we want to build back, I say you build with your strength.
So out of this, we're gonna come up with solutions, suggestions?
I'm not going to come up with a state aid formula for you. You wouldn't accept it even if I did, okay? But the last time that you came up with it, you held hearings, you had a task force to specifically go over it, you had a costing out study, the experts to figure out exactly what it took to provide a sound basic education. They used there are a couple of models that you can use, but they used a successful schools model. Here are schools that are doing what we expect. Here's what we think success is and how it plays out in these districts. Now let's take the cheapest of those and let's figure out how they're able to provide it at a lower rate than this guy over here, okay? And then let's fund it according to that. At the very least, as we go into this process, we have to tweak the old formula to recognize our new reality. You've got to adjust it for poverty, you've got to adjust it for the influx of English language learners that come in. You got to figure out some way to deal with the transience of students who come in with costs and go out with costs. Because we have a date certain every year where our budget is set, and public education is progressive. You can't pick up the kids. If we all of a sudden have to eliminate a program because we've got a bunch of high-cost kids that come in, you can't pick up that kid 2 years later and expect them to have academic results. We've got kids coming in with tremendous language deficits at 4 years old. They come from families where they have maybe 1/10 of the vocabulary that they need when they come in. And yet, we know that preschool works for that. And the state of New York, despite the fact that it claims it has universal pre-K, relies on the local community to pay for the transportation for that pre-K, and it relies on the local school district to front the money to start the program and then wait for reimbursement. It's and the reimbursement doesn't increase. The rural schools had been so decimated during that Great Recession, they don't have the front money. So you're making a societal decision that in rural areas, you're not going to have pre-K, despite the fact that you know that pre-K addresses many of the issues that would ameliorate your remedial action later on, at a much higher cost. So, we've got some kind of common sense decisions to make. That decision by itself, that's a 1-year rollover. You're paying that money. You're just deciding to start paying it this year as opposed to start paying it next year. You know, so you've got to have the policymakers make the decision instead of DOB, because that's a DOB division of the budget. That's a division of the budget
And that's what I'd
decision.
like to point out a little bit. I mean, we've talked about the legislature and the governor, and I don't know if anybody knows how the negotiation goes, but it's a pretty, the governor has an enormous amount of power over our budget, let's face it. He makes his budget January, we go in there and we just, you know how it goes. You've worked in the legislature for 17 years, and we just pound away at it and try to get what we can put into it, and some stuff that we don't feel out of it. So my first year in, we come out, the assembly comes out, we increase the budget $1.5 billion for education. We're like, yes, this is our one house budget, because the assembly does it, the Senate does it. Okay, that's great. You know, we're gonna give our school districts what they need. The governor says, I'm gonna have my budget by April 1st. And you know what we did? We didn't give it to him by April 1st. We waited a week. We said, we're fighting for education. There was something else going on, raise the age or something, that was in the headlines. That's why the budget was being late. It was a lot over education funding and such, because believe me, in my conference,
It's always been a priority.
they fight and they fight and they fight for education funding to ad nauseum, believe me, till midnight. I have to hear the same stories over and over and over again. Okay, so we do that. So April 6th, 7th comes around, we start getting calls from the school districts. Hey, we don't have a budget. We got, I'm like, we're doing what you want. We're holding out for you to get more money. Well, we kind of need to know our numbers here, because we gotta submit a budget next week. We gotta do this. What I'm saying is, it's not a perfect system. It's not even anywhere near a perfect system. But you do have allies fighting for education funding in the New York State legislature.
No question.
The
And that's,
governor says, and you want to talk about mandates? Hey, when we hit the floor, the budget is made up of all this stuff. There's mandates thrown in there that we don't even know are in there, because the budget, the governor says, well, I've come to an agreement with you, right, Carl? I've come to an agreement with you, Andrea, right? Okay, boom, we're gonna vote this thing through. There's so much stuff in there that is snuck, not necessarily snuck in, but put in to make that budget go through in a timely manner, that it's like, you know,
I'll give you an
it's
example.
not a fair system, so to speak, as in the way of, you know, you think, you know, this is what we're doing. The governor has an enormous amount of power over that budget.
I'll make your
And if you
point
want
for
to
you.
come to an agreement, and you want your budget by April 1st,
You
he's
gotta
holding
do
a
it.
big hammer, I'm telling you. So,
State of New York, the governor has more authority than any other governor and the president over the federal budget. I'll give you an example, because we've had 2 court cases that determine this. Some of you may have been around long enough during the Pataki years that we got a state budget in August, because the legislature was holding out. Pataki had vetoed a bunch of increases, and so we waited around until August to get the state budget. And they went to court because he wanted to line item veto out all this stuff.
how do you make out there?
Yeah, the court says he can do it. Okay, so we now have a system where, this is the example I always use. If the governor says in his budget, because he's allowed to put that language in there, any prison that's built in the state of New York has to go to my brother's construction company. Okay? The legislature's only legal response to that is to defund all prisons. They can only remove the money from that line item. That's all their response is. They can't change the language. So the governor either has to agree to lose that language, or you shut down all the prisons in that example. So what happens is, the governor, when he puts in his executive budget, he puts in any number of things. He does it every year. He's got some, well, year before last, his idea was, let's eliminate the state aid formula altogether, and the state aid formula will be whatever the legislature and I decide it's gonna be. That was his idea. The perennial one he always has is special ed programs in the summer will be the responsibility of the school districts, right? He's got 5 or 6 poison pills in there all the time to make guys like Billy negotiate back and get those things out of there, instead of negotiating on the things like what to do with the formula. Because there's only so much money. You've got to buy those things back with the governor. You've got to buy the bad ideas that he's proposed back. And then you've got to tell him, after you bought them back, where you're going to come up with money to pay for those things in addition, right? Nobody's saying this thing's easy. right? It's incredibly complex, and as the governor says, beyond it.
That's kind of the point I was going there when he said, I'm not here to beat up the governor. Hey, if I had the power that he did, we'd be doing pretty well here in the North Country. But, you know, when he says it's beyond me, well, you know what? That budget isn't beyond him, and that formula can't be beyond him. I can't believe that it can be in New York State. I can't, because if it's beyond him, then I'll tell you what are we gonna do? I mean, it's his agency, it's his deal, and that's what a lot of people don't understand in this room as well. Because 50% of the calls I get in my office are dealing with state agencies, and they don't understand when I say, all right, well, I'll make a phone call and I'll see what I can do. And they're like, well, just do it. Well, no, that's the governor's agency. I'm over here in the legislature, so his DOB, Division of Budget, controls your lack of getting your funding on time. You know, so it's an uphill battle when dealing with this. And, you know, I'm not here to beat up on him. I just think if we're going to do this and we're going to make it correct for these rural schools in the formula, then either we start from scratch to make everybody get what they need to get, because we're spending 25 billion?
At the state level.
Yeah, 25 billion, yeah. You know, so we should be able to figure this out. And I hope that we have the leadership there to do it. We need to do it. It's just, you know, it's an enormous amount of money. We spend, like you said, we spend more money than anybody else in the whole United States.
We just do it really badly.
I mean, we have many of the community stakeholders who are the leaders in their organizations in the rooms, and the same type of people are across all of New York State in these sessions. So how do we develop that synergy to then move forward to have an impact? I guess is where I'd like to know.
The concept is to get one unified message. You know, to narrow this thing down as to what really counts. You can't change everything. So we're gonna say, change these things. These are the things that are game changers for rural communities. And then you're absolutely right. We have to have enough of, we have to have a rural community voice. Somebody admonished me last night because I said if you have fewer voices, you have to have louder voices. You know, and they said, you know, it's not that we have fewer voices, because we could have more voices. You know, if I call Billy, I'm white noise. I'm paid to give him this message, okay? The person he really wants to hear from is the little old lady that used to come to my budget meeting every year, and she said the same thing every year. I haven't had kids in this school in 40 years. Why would I want to pay for property tax increases? I wasn't altogether kind. I said, for the same reason I'm paying for your Social Security.
I didn't use that when she came in.
But here's the deal. If she calls Billy and says, my property taxes are too high because the school's raising my property taxes, he expects that call. If she calls and says, my property taxes are too high because you guys haven't fixed the state aid formula and my school district can't supply what the kids need in this district, he doesn't expect that call, okay? He expects Mark's call. He doesn't expect the head of the fire department to call. He doesn't expect the Rotary guys to call. You know, he expects to hear from the people who are specifically impassioned about that issue. We have the ability in an issue or in an age of social media to get a community message. And this is a community crisis. This isn't about schools. The schools are a symptom at this point. The people have left the community. They didn't leave the school. They left the community. The jobs left the community, right? This is a community message that needs to go back. So if we can unify the message and we can offer some solutions, and then we can figure out how to get all of those dispersed people, you know, to get together to have that message. That's what this is about.
And I think we're going to have to. The Senate Education Committee is holding these foundation aid forums, David, all over the state, and I read in your newsletter, and you know, one of my issues is where were we invited to this table? And there's no location other than Syracuse or the city for these Senate-based
They
meetings.
invited me to testify in New York City.
That's wonderful, but New York City, I mean, that's, you know,
No,
so.
I was being
yeah.
ironic about that.
Yes,
I wasn't
absolutely.
saying I get to testify and you don't. I was saying rural schools has to go to New York
You
City.
would prefer the
or
Albany,
New
I
York.
would even take the Albany, location, but that's also, that's quite concerning.
I went to the Syracuse hearing, and the very first comment was, we've got to get rid of this sparsity thing that rural schools get, because we don't get that. Right?
Sure.
It's a very parochial discussion. And we're centered on our needs, and they're centered on their needs. And at some point, we've got to, as I say, we've got to figure out that we've got certain things within our culture that can be funded broadly that makes sense for everybody. Everybody's got English language learner issues. Everybody's got mental health issues. Everybody's got increased poverty. We've got all those things together. We just have to figure out how to incorporate those things into the formula to accurately reflect today's needs, much like the formula from a dozen years ago reflected at the time. And then we've got to make the commitment to fund it. You know, I've heard a lot of people in those hearings say, there's nothing wrong with the formula, just fund it. I really couldn't disagree more. There are things that if you just fund the formula without fixing it, then we get a lot of winners and losers, as he says. Yes, ma'am.
If we're gonna fix the formula, can we fix the property wealth issue? Perfect example, Bocat Valley. Westport has very high property wealth and very low income wealth. But because of that high property wealth, now Bocat Valley, which is the merger of Elizabethtown Lewis and Westport, will now have above average wealth. So Westport has always gotten the due minimum, which could amount to $3,000 increase in foundation aid. And now Bocat Valley will be considered above average property wealth, and now they will have the same situation. So we merged to solve our financial situation, and now I think that we're gonna see a cut in our foundation aid.
Well, it's such a universal problem. I wish I could say it was an anomaly, but take any resort area of New York State, and we've got a boatload of them. The Catskills, the Adirondacks, the Thousand Islands, the shoreline, there are all, the Finger Lakes, there are all kinds of places
Any
where the
community
people who have
on the
always lived
water.
there can no longer afford to live there.
So they have to sell their homes.
And so you get a very gentrified, you know, constituency who doesn't have kids they don't have kids in the school. So you get the declining enrollment, and the people who live there end up having to move out. And let's face it, if you're selling all of your houses to guys my age, 20 years from now, you got a problem.
And that's what's happening along the Lake Ontario and St. Lawrence River, because they're flooding those high properties that typically pay the big taxes. People can't use them. We've been 3 years now where the International Joint Commission on the water levels throughout the Great Lakes have purposely left the water higher, you know, and then in the spring when you have all the runoff from Tug
Just floods.
Hill, it's been a huge mess. And it's now having that trickle down effect. You have the power company calling, why aren't you, you know, turning the power on? Well, you can't get to the boathouse. And then you have the marinas that have these huge boats, nobody's putting their boat in the water, so that affects the gas station and the hotels. And so it's a mess.
Power lines underwater are never a good thing.
Oh, never a good idea. Neither are the gas pumps at the end of the dock. Not a good situation.
I hate to shut this down, but I've kept you 20 minutes over when I promised I would let you go. So anyone that wants to stay and consider and continue to talk, feel free. Any of you that have to go, don't be embarrassed about leaving, because I've kept you longer than I said that I would.
I just have
So-
one question here.
Yeah.
What is the role that the New York State United Teachers is taking with helping get this formula adjusted? Do you know if there's any action from them?
I don't know right now. I know historically. For a long time, I was part of the Educational Conference Board that NYSET is also in. And the Educational Conference Board it's made up of PTA and school boards and NISCUS and ASBO and NYSET and large statewide organizations like that. And they do everything by consensus. Every decision has to be unanimous. And the only thing that we've ever been able to agree on in terms of the formula and have it be unanimous because of NICET has been more money. How it's been distributed, it has never been an area that people could agree on. More money in general has always been their bottom line, quite honestly. The system needs more money. And I don't want to speak for that. So if you can get a more specific answer from NICET reps, please feel free to ask. But that was always my experience in dealing together. Anything else before we go?
David?
Yes, sir.
Jim McCartney, CTE principal here in Ms. BOCES.
Yeah.
Some of our strongest students have been from farming families in CTE education. They have a very keen work ethic. They know what it is to work long hours. All those things we seem to be missing when we talk about soft skills. A lot of these kids have naturally having grown up on farms. I'm wondering about the impact that we're talking about, these financial trends and needs, the impact on our farming families in rural communities in terms of their exodus. They're not, not having youth retention of this really fertile group of people that you would want to come back and return and live in your communities.
I wish there was good news on that front. I mean, the whole statistic the statistic I started off with of going from 17 million acres to 7 pretty much tells the story. Just this past year, we passed a new farm workers bill that from a human equity standpoint makes perfect sense. From a farming financial standpoint, is going to be very challenging in a field that's already very challenged. So we don't have a way. I mean, look at milk farmers. Milk farmers have been struggling with the same prices forever. I can't remember a time when they had a sufficient amount. So we don't have a plan that works. Whether or not there are ideas that are out there, but we've never passed something that's been helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Really appreciate it.